So thank you, Lena. Woo!
Hi, everyone. So as Rose mentioned, my name is Lena. I'm a software developer at Flux Federation. We write Ruby on Rails code, and we power the PowerShop energy retailer. And my Twitter handle is up there if you have any comments or thoughts. But today, I'm here to talk to you about choosing failure. So you might be thinking, why on earth would I choose to fail? It's really funny because when I started planning for this talk, even before I started actually writing the talk, when I was proposing it, a lot of people asked me this question. I ran it past my friends and my colleagues, and they said, why on earth would you encourage people to do this? And I think it kind of brought up a cultural thing to me, the fact that a lot of us seem to be pretty averse to failure. And I started wondering why that is, and I was looking at my own background. I am Russian by birth, and I remember being a really little girl and doing some crafts with my grandmother, and her saying, you know, Lena, you have to make sure that you measure everything 7 times so that you only cut things once. And, you know, that stuck with me, the whole idea of trying to plan ahead and do things right. But not everybody has a Russian grandmother talking in their ear, so why might you be averse to failure? Well, maybe it's fear that failure might be career limiting. Maybe you don't want to be a tall poppy. It could be anything. There's lots of reasons why. And I think that further to any personal reasons, there are also wider cultural reasons. I've been to school in New Zealand, I've been to school in Russia, I've been to school in the United States, and everywhere I've been to school, through the schooling system, we had this idea of standardized testing. This idea that on one day, you take a test, and the fewer mistakes you make on that test, the better grades you get, and the more competent you prove yourself, and the more you prove that you actually know what you're talking about. And I think that maybe inadvertently that created a bit of an assumption inside of many people's minds, it definitely created one inside of mine, that the more competent you are, the fewer mistakes you will make. And I will come back to this a few times throughout the talk, but I'd like you to really think about this and what this means and whether you believe this as well. So switching pace a little bit, I want to talk about where I come from, because I mentioned that I'm a software developer, but I didn't say how I came to be one. And I actually have a design degree. And I remember in one of the first classes that we ever had in my design degree in first year, we were doing this class that had to do with design practice. And our lecturer got us to run through this challenge called the Marshmallow Tower Challenge. Now, some of you might be familiar with this challenge, some of you might not be, and I think the story is hilarious either way. So I remember that it was, like I said, one of the first days we were there. And we were all sitting there, we didn't really know each other, and the lecturer sat us around tables with this brown paper bag concealing some materials. And they said to us, you will have 18 minutes, don't touch the bags, you'll have 18 minutes using the stuff inside these bags to build the tallest freestanding structure you can possibly build. And at the end of the 18 minutes, you have to have a marshmallow balancing on top. And the person who builds, well, the team that builds the tallest structure gets to win and has the admiration of their peers for the rest of the day, which was fantastic. So, of course, we got to thinking, and we quickly discovered that we will be the winning group. Because we had a whole bunch of people who were fresh out of high school, who were really into crafts, who had done things like woodworking and hard materials technology, and we were really into this sort of thing. We had spaghetti strings and string and tape and this marshmallow, and we were like, yeah, this will be great. And if I remember correctly, we actually had somebody who had some sort of an architectural drafting qualifications. We were like, we've got this. So we spent most of our time drawing out how we're going to build this tower and measuring the spaghetti sticks and drawing the structure. And if it was up to us, it looked like we were going to build something about 1 meter tall. And it was going to just blow everyone out of the water, and it was going to be amazing. So we had a couple of minutes left, under 5 minutes, and the lecturer said, you know, your time's coming up. It's time to build something. And we go, yeah. So we start building our thing, following our brilliant plan, and of course, nothing works. The spaghetti strips snap, the string is way too short, the tape is gluing to itself, We had this really clever idea of making a little basket out of the spaghetti strips for the marshmallow, because we thought that everyone else's marshmallows will just roll off the top. But we were clever. We made a basket, so it's just going to sit there. But it was way too heavy for the structure, so none of our clever technologies worked. And at the end, we just threw all the plans out, and we'll be lucky if we made something that was 15 centimeters tall, which was really disappointing. But looking around, everybody had pretty similar results. So the winner was announced, and that was really great. But then our lecturer told us, you know, this exercise actually has a really important point. It's all about telling you that mistake making matters. So what was it that made us fail? We were so sure that we were going to do really well. And we had all these assumptions about what we knew and what these materials were going to act like. And we relied on those really heavily. Our lecturer told us that there are many, many different groups of people who do this exercise all over the world. And there's one group of people in particular that in any demographic and any place just does remarkably well, better than anyone else. They build the tallest structures. The structures are the most interesting and the most intricate. And the lecturer asked us, who do you think that is? And we were like, well, probably architects. I don't know. And the lecturer said, no, actually preschool children. And the reason that they do so well is because they don't have this aversion to failure coded into them. They just put things together and they make mistakes and they watch them fall apart. And then they take the way that the things fell apart and they use that to inform the next iteration of the thing that they're making. And it turns out that adults actually made up a name for this, especially in the design field. We call this the design process. You might have seen some variation of this before. So this is a process that's used heavily in design practice where we get some sort of a brief, we define a problem, then we research it or brainstorm some ideas or assumptions, then we validate those assumptions, propose solutions, validate those solutions, make some prototypes, and hopefully improve. And this process isn't linear, it's very cyclical. From any point, especially the ones that I've bolded, you can go back and you might even get so far as prototyping things and then suddenly realize you're trying to solve the wrong problem. And you might go back to the drawing board, and that's absolutely fine. But that's design talk, right? What does that have to do with us here at a tech conference in the tech industry? Let's talk about the tech industry. What do we do? Why are we here? I was thinking about this a lot when I was going from design to writing software. I was thinking, what drew me here? Why do I want to do this? And I thought that something that I find really important is that we solve problems. A lot of the people around me were keen problem solvers, really analytical and creative thinkers. And there are people who like to get things right, but also people who like to learn along the way. Everybody that I work with constantly tries to learn new things. We have days at work dedicated to learning new things. And it looks like that's what's attractive about this industry. For me, the thing that's so important to me that keeps me coming back to work every day is not just the fact that I get to play around with code and solve puzzles all day. That's fantastic. But I also get to make people's lives at least a little bit better with the stuff I make, hopefully. I think many other people do too. We want to solve problems in a problem-solving industry. So we've got all of these people who want to solve problems in this industry that's all about, hopefully, making things better. And we have all these people who like to learn and get things right. So there's got to be some metrics for knowing that we've solved the problems and we've gotten things right and we've made things better. So I started thinking about those metrics, mostly because it's a talk about failure, so I should probably talk about success as well. And I was thinking, how do we know that we successfully made something? How do we measure that we've succeeded at what we've done? When I first started studying to be a software developer, when I first started learning and when I first started my job, I was thinking about this a lot because I wanted to do well. And something I came up with quickly was that maybe we're successful if we're confident that the thing we built won't break. Because we spend a lot of time and effort to achieve that end, right? We have lots of people researching and planning things. We do peer programming, we do code reviews. We test things locally. We test things through quality assurance. We ship things in small batches so that we can back out, right? We do a lot of work to make sure that the stuff we make won't break. But the more I started looking at how things really worked, and the more I worked in the industry, the more I started to think that maybe this is a really dangerous measure. And one of the reasons that it looks really dangerous is because it's still rested on this assumption that confident people won't make mistakes. That if we take all of the right steps and we're all smart, good people, then we won't fail and we won't get things wrong. But the thing is that we don't know what will happen 100% of the time. And if we link our competence to how few mistakes we're making, maybe we'll be less inclined to look for those mistakes when they happen or to own up to them. So what's a better way? Well, maybe it's that we can be confident that no matter how the thing we made breaks, we're equipped to deal with that. Now, I think that's a lot more productive because it removes some of that blame, it gives us something to do, but also challenges this assumption that competency is somehow related to error counts. So, I put this up a few slides ago, this thing about how the more competent we are, the fewer mistakes we make. And I found that the longer I was working in the tech industry, the less sure of this I was. And maybe you're not so sure now too. But maybe you're not convinced yet. So I'm going to keep going. So the tech industry, we have job requirements. We want to engage with this iterative design process, right? Some of us do agile, some of us do sprints. We find things out and we fail repeatedly, we adjust our behavior. We constantly have to keep learning and we have to keep mastering a craft, and failing is just encoded into learning. But at the same time, we have to measure our successes through decreasing error counts. Now that didn't seem right to me. That means that we have to come to work every day and feel deeply incompetent for doing our job exactly how we were asked to do it. That's not right. So when I started working at Flux, back then it was called PowerShop, and it was my very first job in software. And I enjoyed it so much. I loved the people I was with, I loved the work, it was interesting and it was engaging, and I really didn't want to appear incompetent. I didn't want them to think that they took a chance on me, on somebody who's switching industries and they'd hired a fool. So I stopped trusting myself. I stopped trusting myself to solve things the way that I know how to solve them, to engage with tools that I already knew, like the design process, because I didn't want to make mistakes, and I didn't want to look like I didn't know what I was doing. But after a couple of days or weeks, I started noticing that something was wrong. I was around all of these clever people that I looked up to, and I didn't want to look silly in front of them. But these clever people around me weren't doing the thing that I was trying to do. They weren't masking their mistakes. They weren't shying away from difficult questions. They owned up to it when they didn't know something, very freely and very willingly. And something started to change. I started noticing that my learning speed was directly proportional to my willingness to fail. I started noticing that the more willing I was to make lots of mistakes, the more willing I was to try new things and to ask questions, the faster I learned and the more productive my team became. I remember one specific moment when it was right before I stand up on my first team, and I've gone through this change, and it was one that I owned, and I was in charge of it, and I was like, yeah, great, we've tested this, and everything's really good. And I merged it to master, and master went red. So I was freaking out. We were just before stand up, and my team was like, okay, let's talk about what we're going to do for the day. And I'm like, I can't do this. I broke everything. And somebody on my team said, it's okay. You're not a real developer until you break master. And all of these people were so supportive and so okay with me messing up. And it was great. So that was a real turning point for me, and this new dynamic of making mistakes, using that to drive my learning, accepting that into my life, it meant a lot to me, and it made me a better developer, and it made me better at what I was doing. And I wanted to pass that on to others, because many people were incredibly generous with their time in helping me become the person I was and the professional I was. So I started getting into mentorship, and two groups that are really close to my heart in particular are Rails Noobs, which I co-organize with some other lovely people. It's a monthly meetup, and if you are Wellington-based, you're most welcome to join. And also Rails Girls Wellington, which is the Wellington branch of an international series of workshops that helps women and non-binary folk get into software development through Ruby on Rails. One workshop that I was doing at all of these was called Intro to Rails. Now, this is an interactive demo where we take this idea that you can make a blog on Rails in 15 minutes, except it usually takes more like an hour. And we go through it, and myself or whoever's running the workshop, we explain bits of Rails and bits of MVC and all of that kind of good stuff through the workshop. And when I ran my first intro to Rails, and quite a few that followed, I took a lot of time to prepare, and I took a lot of time to practice exactly what I was doing, practice the commands, clear the screen so there's nothing weird going on, make sure that nothing blows up, and everything's just really clean and tidy, and it looks just like an online tutorial, and it's perfect. And after doing this a couple of times, I felt really bad, because I was actually doing the thing that I was trying to get away from. I was perpetuating this idea that competent people don't make mistakes, because I wanted to prove that I was competent enough to teach. So I started doing what I do in everyday life, the thing that made me get into mentoring. I started driving all the learning with mistake making, with this philosophy of let's break it and see what happens. We started making it look like the red screens are your friends. We started throwing up errors on the screen and going, how do we solve this together? What do we do now? And it worked really, really, really well. We started prioritizing problem solving over problem avoidance. One thing I noticed with a lot of these groups and with myself when I was first learning was that oftentimes people would go through a tutorial or something of the sort. They would take a couple of steps, then something would break. And then they wouldn't know what to do. Because in the tutorial, everything went perfectly. Everything just worked. So how are you supposed to get past that? How are you supposed to keep learning? Now, when we happily throw up errors on the screen, just like it happens every single day in our lives, and when we happily use Google to figure out what's going on and go on Stack Overflow and figure out what terms to use and don't shy away from the errors or refresh the screen, something really great happens. We start to learn how to get past that blocker and how to learn more stuff. And people responded really positively to that. This is a response from 2016 Rails Girls, where an attendee actually really enjoyed this idea that if we're making mistakes, that means we're learning. That means that we're trying something new. Because if you're doing the thing that you've done 100 times before, you're pretty unlikely to make mistakes. But you're also pretty unlikely to learn something. You're pretty unlikely to do something amazing, right? And it wasn't just attendees. Other developers were actually happy too. They said, yes, this is what we do every day. Why don't we teach this? Why do we act like everything we do is perfect? Why don't we codify failure into everything we do? So the whole idea behind the Intro to Rails and all of the stuff that goes around it is purposeful failure, which is different to just failing on purpose, right? It gives people problem-solving techniques. It stops people from making the same mistake over and over and over again, and that mistake stopping you from getting to anything else. It also removes a barrier to learning, which is really great. And that's all really fantastic for people who are starting to learn to code. But I think it can be fantastic for everyone else too. I think we can use some of this stuff in our everyday practice. I think we should ask every single day what will happen when we encounter the unexpected. And I'm not just talking about your code not running correctly the way you expect. I'm not just talking about raising an exception. I'm talking about thinking about what you're making and talking to lots of people and checking whether it actually solves the problem. I know that there's so many things that my personal perspective hides from me when it comes to the things that I make. I remember when I was in design school, at one point I was working on a layout for a website, and somebody looked at it and they said, well, this looks great, and the colors are lovely, but if somebody has color blindness, the contrast will be really low and it will be illegible. I didn't know this before, and I wouldn't have known this, and I wouldn't have known to ask. There's so much that we don't know that we don't know. And it could even be down to things like always testing your stuff on the same browser and then somebody not being able to use it. There are just so many assumptions that our perspective hides. And so it's great to ask what happens when we encounter the unexpected, things that we don't know to expect. So I put this up a while ago, this thing about how the more competent you are, the fewer mistakes you make. This assumption that many of us have. And I actually want to scratch that. I don't think this is an assumption. I think this is an illusion. I think that a much healthier, better way, much more productive way to think about this, I think that will help us grow, is thinking that the more competent we are, the more confident we get making mistakes. Because when we make mistakes, we learn new things. We run into scenarios we haven't encountered before. We learn ways of handling things that we weren't aware of. Because we can't keep doing the same thing all the time and just getting things right if we really want to make something great. So if you don't go away remembering most of what I just said, that's absolutely fine. But I want you to go away with this one thought. I want you to go away with a fierce desire to make mistakes and to encourage mistake-making in others. I think that our industry will benefit immensely if we do something to tear down this idea that people are either inherently good at something or inherently bad at something. And this idea that competent people don't make mistakes. This illusion that we just do things right from the start and they just happen correctly because we know everything. This illusion that we don't Google things 50 times a day. I think that we should prioritize trial and error and iteration and improvement instead. So I'd like to encourage all of you to go out today, learn all of this amazing stuff we're going to be presented with, try it out, fail miserably at it, learn something, and choose to fail every day. Thank you.